Hello and welcome to a CNBC Africa special. We're joined by Dr. Agnes Kalibata, the president of AGRA, Africa Green Revolution Alliance. She's joined us to discuss about how a series of global crises is exacerbating the vulnerable sections of food systems in Africa. We're going to talk about how we're dealing with them and tackling them and break down the upcoming AGRF 2022. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with AGRF 2022. The fact that it's happening this time in Rwanda, what brings it to Rwanda? Why put the focus here? Although I understand it's Pan-Africa. And what's special this time?
Thank you again. We do have a partnership with the government of Rwanda. A while ago, just before COVID started, we decided that rather than go to a different country each year, which has huge cost implications, we needed to settle down and have what we are calling a home and away model. In that home and away model, we do have a home country. So Rwanda won the bid to be a home country for the AGRF for a period of about 5 years. Actually, most of that would have happened during COVID, but because of COVID and because we didn't have an actual conference during COVID-19, the agreement with Rwanda starts this year. So Rwanda will be hosting the AGRF every other year, just really to ensure that we have great facilities, we don't have to run around. The country has invested so much in ensuring they have the right facilities. So we take advantage of that. And so for at least the next few years, we live here.
It happened in Kenya last year, and the theme was the same as it is this year, building resilience in food systems. Is it not?
So what is definitely not going away is the need to build resilience and the need to work from a food system perspective. So we might be tweaking words a little bit from this and that, but we do recognize that we are at a different and a difficult time in our lives. We are coming at this, we just came out of COVID-19, we now are undergoing a major food crisis, which is, from an African perspective, anchored in a financial crisis that has come as a result of COVID, but also which is anchored in a climate change crisis that is not going away. So for Africa, there are multiple crises that are happening at the same time, and it's just becoming so difficult for countries to be able to be on top of ensuring that we have the right level of food, ensuring that we have the right level of reducing poverty in rural areas, and ensuring that we come through on the 2030 agenda, because for us, because we live in food systems, this is our trajectory out of, this is our trajectory of achieving the 2030 agenda and out of poverty.
Right, so these would be the focus points for AGRF 2022. They were also similar focus points were there for 2021. We'll delve into the details of how far we've come in the last 1 year. But let's address the triple threat that we're talking about here: climate impact, the conflict, the pandemic. Even in spaces where we didn't expect to see those issues, especially with what has happened in Ukraine. So if you can take it from the top.
Yeah, so let's start from the beginning, what I would call the beginning. Remember, I was Minister of Agriculture here in this country. I left in 2014. I would say I could pinpoint the very time climate started being a challenge, sometime in 2013. I mean, I had great time in the ministry from 2008, that when I was there, to 2012, really good seasons all through. But 2013, somewhere things changed. And when you look at it from an African perspective, yields have been decreasing on the continent from 2014 till the time of COVID, which of course took things further. And all this is because of droughts and droughts and droughts. You have, every 2 years you have one drought year, or you have a flood year that makes things difficult. So that's one perspective. Yields were on the decrease for a continent that was beginning to actually celebrate value out of the agricultural sector because we were investing in CADAP. The next crisis becomes COVID, completely unforeseen, completely devastating. How devastating was it? The fact that today over 60 countries, and I mean 60%, sorry, the fact that today over 60% of African countries have more than 50% of their debt to GDP ratio, their GDP in debt. They can't be able to pay. They're having challenges to be able to pay their debt, right? So for these countries, that happened because they took so much of their resources into dealing with the pandemic, which is the right thing to do. Completely unplanned for, completely unexpected, but totally devastating. So immediately after that, unplanned again, we do have the Russian crisis that exacerbates fuel prices, that makes it very difficult for countries to plan. And we were already talking about debt relief and getting out of debt, but again, this happens. And remember, climate change hasn't gone away. So you still have climate change, you still have the remnants of COVID-19, and then there's the fuel crisis that makes food a crisis. And of course, there are some foods that were also coming from that part of the region that completely throws people off balance. The result is, in some countries, you have 40% inflation coming from food-related issues. In some countries, you have exchange rate, inability to get forex. In some countries, you have inability to do anything at all because countries are completely constrained with the ability to be able to engage the populations and be able to provide the type of support they can have. So, I mean, you ask yourself, how much more can a country take on? How much more can a community take on? And which takes me to the last point. For me, all this speaks to one thing, that we must recognize the interconnectedness of our world. We are so interconnected. There's nothing that happens in one part of the world that does not impact people in other parts of the world. Climate change is not an African making, but it is has been impacting Africa the most until recently, of course, when other people are beginning to see the impact as well. We can't afford to put our heads in the sand on climate change issues, which is some of the things that people around the world have been doing. We've been saying climate change is killing us. And, you know, everybody was like, no, it's manageable. I guess people are beginning to see that's actually not just a problem of people on the equator around the world. It is a global problem.
We actually chatted about that last year, and you made a very interesting point that the fact that Africa wasn't ready for the pandemic was to the extent of having no food reserves. That's a question I want to take you back to. Yeah. Now, this is over a year. After over a year, we are having this conversation again. Where have we reached now? What changes have been made when it comes to, of course, we understand we're not sufficient yet in terms of production, but what about the reserves? How seriously are those being taken? So
there's something very interesting about food reserves. Let me first recognize that Africa is exactly the same size as India, in population, in size, and in elaborate. India has enough food to feed a population the size of the African continent's population for 1.5 years in terms of reserves. When the pandemic hit Africa, we actually had very few countries had 3 months of reserves. But the challenge is easy to understand for me, having worked in the Ministry of Agriculture here in Rwanda. I can't tell you how many people tell us from a development perspective that food reserves are distortionary, that government-led food reserves are distortionary. But the rest of the world, except Africa, does have food reserves, and it is only Africa that has taken that messaging seriously. Food reserves are not distortionary, they are only distortionary if you cannot feed your people. Having people die when you have the ability to produce and save food is what is distortionary. So I guess these are some things that we have to deal with. And yes, I do understand that we need to manage markets well, and we need to ensure that markets work. But for Africa not to have food reserves, for us to have found ourselves in the place where we found ourselves when the pandemic started, which is, I met 11 countries at the start of the pandemic. Less than 3 countries had any food reserves. I was just proud that Rwanda was one of the countries that had food reserves. But the thing is, immediately, then everybody understood the need to have food reserves. Even then, it was not sufficient for what was coming with the Ukraine crisis. Nobody had foresight.
Now, just last year, you had at AGRF, the summit, one very interesting thing, the deal room. where they were looking to matchmake and facilitate up to 5 billion from private and public investments. I wanted to know how successful was that, and how would you look at this year's raising funds for these specific activities?
So the deal room is a very interesting and very important place to talk about the AGRF, because we saw it as an opportunity to bring people together, public, private sector, big private sector, small private sector, to resolve the complexities of investing in the agricultural sector in Africa. The complexities is such that, yes, the public sector can invest, but we know it's not sustainable. The private sector does invest, but it needs a whole lot of nudging and a whole lot of support to get significant investments on the ground. So the deal room is a facilitation place where we nudge people forward, where we bring people together, but also where we show opportunities, and where we say, yes, you're not alone in this need to invest, you're not alone in this quest to invest. There are lots of public institutions that are ready to support and to help, but let the investments happen. I think what needs to happen differently this year is all of us recognizing that more than any other time, there is an opportunity to invest in Africa, because Africa sees the opportunity of the agriculture, sees the missed opportunity of the agricultural sector itself. It is a market, we are a market. 14 countries in Africa produce wheat, but we are all suffering because Ukraine has shut down on wheat. Is that realistic, honestly? Or is that's a missed opportunity? Many countries in South America have bumped up their production because there's a global need. Why aren't these markets open? I mean, why isn't Africa taking advantage of these markets? But we have decided not to invest enough in agriculture. So I think the opportunity is now. I just saw that Nigeria just put how many? $1.2 billion in investing in irrigation in one of the states, and so many countries are doing the same. So I think the opportunities now, this AGRF is going to be talking about how can we invest differently, and how can we create the opportunities here on the continent. How can we re-own our food security, our food production systems, and our markets?
So look at some of these statistics here, that Africa imports agricultural products worth 60 billion USDs every year, and by 2025 that could be 110 billion, something that is not sustainable or affordable. Another interesting thing is that it also exports quite a bit, like about 35 billion to 40 billion, and about 8 billion of that flows through intra-regional trade in these products. Now, the fact that you were saying leveraging what you already have to meet the needs of a market that has suddenly opened up. How do you look at approaching AFCFTA from the point of view of building food resilience, food system resilience in Africa? We are now 1.5 years after AFCFTA was supposed to really kick off. What are we seeing? Are we going to stay at 8 billion a year? Or?
8 billion is nothing compared to what we have the potential to do. 8 billion is nothing compared to what we are importing from other regions. We have a 15% intra-regional trade, where other continents have 70% intra-regional trade. So that's why I say 8 billion is nothing. In 2008, when we had the food crisis, we were importing $15 billion worth of food. Today, we've multiplied that nearly by 5. There's very clear, on that trajectory, it's definitely very clear, based on what you're saying, that we are going to multiply that by 5 by 2030. We will be moving from 50 billion or 60 billion today to another 100 or 120 billion today. So again, the missed opportunity here is every time we are spending that money to bring food in there, the biggest missed opportunity is the number of jobs for Africa's young people that could be created in the agricultural sector. It's so big, it's almost ridiculous that we have so many young people that can't be employed. So that's number one. Number two, we can't get the African Free Continental Trade Area to work if we don't capitalize on some of these huge opportunities. Food is $10 trillion of industry. The whole world recognizes that. It's just difficult to understand how Africa missed that. So that's what Under the Bridge today. Let's use this as an opportunity. This AGRF, this crisis, whatever is happening today, has to be a wake-up call where Africa says we are going to invest differently. Excuse me. The African Free Continental Trade Area has just been kicked off. I think 6 countries have now started working on it. So I hope that the 8 trillion will quickly move up. I hope that we'll go ahead and remove all these barriers to trade. I hope that the opportunity, the missed opportunity again from trading with each other, from building a market internally that allows us to move to the 70% like other continents. I hope that we see that. I hope that we see that we are the losers when we don't do these things. So,
it is a brilliant move when you want to unify a market this diverse and could be so well connected. But also the fact that we are still under threat. So you speak about investments, very important area, and how and where to invest, for what time frames. So what are some key areas that you would say would actually develop the ecosystem that would in turn bring in more investment?
I love that you're talking about developing a robust ecosystem for investments and for growing the agriculture sector, because the institution I work for, AGRA, we really look at systems investments as very critical to moving the agriculture sector forward. And systems investments is what? It's about having stronger capability for farmers to access the things they need, better innovations, access to improved seeds, access to fertilizers. We know now that there's a fertilizer crisis that will exacerbate the food crisis that is going on. But even then, less than 50% of the Africans were accessing the fertilizers they need. Africa still has the lowest levels of use of fertilizers, even though it's very critical in increasing production. So that system that delivers those inputs to farmers, in many cases, don't serve the purpose they are supposed to serve or don't exist. The institutions that support that ecosystem don't exist enough and in enough places to be able to reach enough farmers. When they do exist, the markets don't work. The market systems that are supposed to take up everything that the farmer produces, create more incentive for the farmer to produce, fail to work because the processing capacity hasn't been invested in, because we are not investing enough in industrialization and adding value to what we produce. So all those challenges pile up and really create a situation where there's no point in producing more than what you need if you are a farmer, because you don't make any money from that. In fact, it erodes your capital. But we need to go beyond that. We need to ensure that farmers have access to the means they need to produce. More importantly, we don't have the luxury anymore not to strengthen resilience. It means we have to do that and do it under difficult conditions. We are under drought, under threats of drought here and there. We need to invest in resilience. So things that would have been easier to do 5 years ago, 10 years ago, we are going to be doing double to achieve the same thing. So for example, look at fertilizers. Today, for the same amount of money you would have used the last year to reach, let's say, 1 million farmers, you're going to have to use 3 times that amount of money to deliver the same fertilizers you delivered last year. So it's becoming very difficult. But we do know that unless we invest, there's no shortcut. So like you're saying, let's build a system that takes inputs to farmers. Let's build a system that takes extension to farmers and give them the knowledge they need. Let's use the digital innovation that are in place now. Let's employ Africa's young people to be part of these innovations, to be part of creating a new ecosystem. Let's take advantage of our God-given gift, land and people. We do have these at our disposal, but they can't work without the systems working for them. So that's why public investments right now continue to be the #1 factor that gets to catalyze that ecosystem to work, but also to make it possible for private sector to invest. Private sector is not going to invest where the public sector hasn't done their part. So I think, again, the opportunities now, if we had, for any reason, had thought that the agricultural sector in Africa is not important, we now know it's important because we need to feed ourselves. There's something I always say, and it's something I just fail to understand how we don't internalize that and use it. There's no single country, maybe Singapore, There's no single country out there that is gotten where it is gotten in development without using the agriculture sector as a backbone of moving forward, of moving people from the agriculture, from the land up into more job creating opportunities, into industrialization, to manufacturing and to services. There are very few countries. That's why in the history of the world, there was a period in time that was called agricultural revolution. That's the time when there was massive investments in getting people to use the land to produce and use it to be capital to create other forms of employment. So even as people are employing other people in technologies, in all sorts of sophisticated things, including space, there was a time all that was coming from two things: land, water, and our labor as people.
Another thing to look at is the fact that you were talking about public-private finance being mixed. How about also philanthropic finance, also developmental agencies and banks? So basically a very blended approach for at least sort of catalyzing where we have lost in the last 2-3 years and to catch up.
Yeah. So blended funding, public philanthropy, and then private sector on the other hand is going to be much more important now than ever before. It was important in the past because we were talking about the risks of agricultural sector, but really anchored on smallholder farmers and the viability of smallholder farmers. Well, that is now even more risky because of climate change, right? The sector that the farmers are finding themselves in, the fact that SMEs that work in the agricultural sector, the sector that SMEs that are working in this sector are finding themselves in a much more difficult position because of climate change. Yeah. So like I said, we missed the opportunity to do it easy. We are going to do it the hard way because we are working against climate change. Not doing it the hard way though is not even an option because we have to feed people. If we didn't do anything else, we have to feed people, right? If we didn't do anything else, we need to get people out of poverty. So we are going to invest in people. We are going to invest in smallholder farmers. We are going to invest in those small SMEs. The only way we can do that, realistically do that, and make it easier for private sector to come in is if we do blended financing. If we use the public resources, philanthropic resources, to really take that risk out and increase the capability and the ability of private sector to come in, to want to come in and give them a little bit of lead time before they can start making their money back. Otherwise, nobody will invest.
Yeah, I have certainly firsthand observed that in Rwanda, where I've seen these incredible agri-tech companies that are doing really good work, but there is very little intake, uptake of their services, precisely because and most of them are not cash flow positive for that reason. But the reason why they're able to sustain until they can become cash flow positive is essentially because of blended finance. Now, one of the things that has actually gained traction with climate conferences around the world in just the last 2-3 years is actually food. Now it's really, agriculture is really seeing a sort of a front seat at COP conferences. At COP27, now after AGRF, you won't have much time going towards COP27. What are you hoping to take from this year's AGRF 2022 to COP27 in Egypt? Especially it's happening in Africa and keeping agriculture as a central focal point. How do you think that's going to turn out? What are your expectations?
So this probably gives me an opportunity to talk about last year's summit, the Food System Summit, which I led, right? The Food System Summit recognizes all these challenges that bring the agricultural production systems and the environmental systems and the challenges we have around environment and nutrition. So what we need to do going into COP27 and how we are positioning AGRF this year is to come up with really consolidated ideas around how food systems need to be the way we move forward. We are very lucky that and very happy that the African continent participated in a big way in the Food System Summit. We do have a continental position. In this AGRF, we are advancing that continental position by making sure that countries are actually showing clear investments that are food system type of investments. As a continent, we want to provide that leadership. We want to be in the lead of ensuring that we are investing in food systems so that people can see that even though we are not responsible for climate change, we are committed to fighting and ensuring that climate change does not impact how we feed ourselves. Going into COP27, This is the message we are taking, that we must deal with climate change. We must put all hands on deck in fighting the impact of climate change through food systems. And the food system is a contributor. We need to reduce that contribution from food systems. But most importantly, Africa is most impacted by climate change, and the world has committed to adaptation funding to ensure that Africa can survive the impact of climate change.
I was just coming to that. We are constantly talking about mitigation around the world. And for some reason, even in Africa, you just spoke about the food industry being a massive contributor to emissions. True, not true for Africa yet. Is it? No. So Africa's contribution as it is to global emissions is negligent to an extent.
It's actually biggest contribution is taking in everybody else's emissions.
Exactly. Right. So what about the adaptation finance? Because while within climate finance, we've seen some improvement. We haven't globally, we have actually failed to match the pledges that were made. But when it comes down to adaptation, it's even worse. There seems to be very little focus, even though the COP26 there was a lot of talk about adaptation being under focus. But if you just look at the numbers, the amount of money that has come in for specifically adaptation, which I think Africa needs more than mitigation, except for energy transformation, it will be adaptation that Africa needs. So what is happening there? You just spoke about it. Please elaborate. What are we going to get from COP27 after the UN Food Summit? Also, the ADS Africa Dialogue Series had the same concern, food being the top of the list. But where are we getting this money from? Because adaptation is what we need. We need the funds to be able to keep agricultural production going. Where water is a massive scarcity and a massive issue. So where are we putting these adaptation funds? When are they going to come?
So the question of when are they going to come is very interesting. We need adaptation financing. The world has committed to that. If there's one thing we would take to COP27, is that as Africa, as a continent, is that the world come through on adaptation financing. We are in nearly $1 trillion of what? Unpaid funds, right? Unpaid resources in adaptation. But listen, the biggest challenge for adaptation for me, the biggest challenge is not the biggest challenge, yes, is that countries that have committed to putting forward adaptation resources are not doing so. But even more important, look at it this way. Whatever resources are available, what I consider to be completely unacceptable is that these resources come as loans. I even ask myself, do our governments know that they are borrowing adaptation resources?
I really appreciate everything that you've just shared with us, and I wish you all the best for AGRF 2022, about to begin in a couple of weeks. And to end this, from everything that Dr. Kalibata has mentioned, it is important to note that about a quarter of Africa's population is currently facing threats of food insecurity. And so to take a consensus and a comprehensive approach with the expertise of experts like Dr. Kalibata is very important for all governments to move together in tandem, especially as we approach COP27 and look into bigger funding pools. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Kalibata. This was a CNBC Africa special.